The desert wind carried the sound of crows before Silas Crow ever saw the tree. Not buzzards, crows, sharp and insistent, the kind that called to something still breathing. He nudged his horse forward through the dry wash, sweat already soaking through his shirt collar, and that's when the cottonwood came into view. 7 ropes swayed beneath its branches. He thought they were corpses at first, some outlaw gang strung up as a warning. But as he came closer, the hair on his neck stood cold. They were girls, Apache girls, necks bound, feet dangling 6 inches above sand that showed desperate scratch marks where they'd fought the nooses. Silas spurred his horse hard. His hand went to the nearest wrist, pulse faint but there. He yanked his knife free and started sawing through the first rope, the hemp fibers catching on the blade. The eldest girl's eyes snapped open mid-fall. She spat at him, blood on her cracked lips. "White devil," she hissed in broken English. Then her head lolled back and she whispered, "He's coming back. The land thief." Silas cut the remaining 6 ropes as fast as his knife would let him, catching each girl before she hit the ground. The youngest couldn't have been more than 9 years old. Her wrists were rubbed raw where the hemp had bitten in, and when he laid her in the shade, her breathing came in shallow, rattling pulls. He poured water from his canteen into a tin cup, his hands shaking harder than he wanted to admit. The eldest, the one who'd spat at him, watched through half-closed eyes as he brought the cup to her lips. She turned her head away. "Ain't poisoned," Silas said quietly. He took a sip himself, then offered it again. This time she drank. 3 small swallows, deliberate and controlled, then she pushed the cup toward her sisters. The other 6 passed it between them in silence, each taking exactly the same amount, not a drop wasted. Silas crouched a few feet back, giving them space. The sun hammered down on the dry riverbed, and the cottonwood's shadow was already shrinking. He pulled a strip of jerky from his saddlebag and held it out. The eldest girl stared at him for a long moment. Her eyes were dark, sharp, and full of something Silas recognized from his own mirror, the kind of anger that didn't burn hot. It simmered. "Why you cut rope?" she asked, her voice rough as stone. "White man want us dead." Silas didn't have an answer that would satisfy her. He knew that much, so he just said, "Ain't right, that's all." She studied him a moment longer, then took the jerky, tore it into 7 pieces, handed one to each sister before taking the last for herself. "You got a name?" Silas asked. "Naylin." She tilted her chin toward the others. "My sisters." Silas Crow. He wiped the sweat off his brow with the back of his hand. "You said somebody's coming back." "Who?" Naylin's jaw tightened. "Land thief? White man with papers? He take our spring, say we leave. We do not leave." So he... She touched her throat where the rope had burned a raw red line. Silas felt something cold settle in his gut. He glanced back at the ropes still swaying in the breeze, and that's when he noticed the fibers. Fresh hemp, clean-cut ends. Not weathered, not old. He pulled a piece from his pocket, rubbed it between his fingers. The texture was wrong. For something that had been out here long, this rope had been bought recent, maybe days ago. "You know his name?" Silas asked. "This land thief?" Nolan's eyes went distant. "Kern. Thaddeus Kern." The name hit Silas like a fist. He'd heard it in town. Kern was a federal man now, Indian Affairs Commissioner or some such title, the kind of man who could make a piece of paper mean more than a person's life. "He'll come back," Naylin said again, quieter this time. "When he sees we still breathe." Silas looked at the 7 of them, bone-thin, burnt by sun and rope both, but still watching him with that same sharp, simmering anger. He thought about riding away. Thought about how much easier his life would be if he just pointed them toward Mexico and pretended he'd never heard the crows. But then the youngest sister coughed, a wet, choking sound, and Silas made his choice. "Can you ride?" he asked Naylin. She nodded once. "My line camp's 6 miles west. Got a well, some shade. You'll be safe there while we figure this out." Nolan tilted her head, suspicious. "Why you help?" Silas hesitated. The truth was complicated, tangled up in things he didn't like to remember. Sand Creek, the sound of a woman singing as she died. The way he'd left the cavalry 3 days later and never looked back. "Because somebody should have cut those ropes sooner," he finally said. By the time they reached the line camp, the sun was past its peak and the shadows stretched long across the hardpan. Silas's horse plodded forward, carrying 2 of the younger girls while the others walked. Nolan kept pace beside him, silent, scanning the horizon like she expected rifles to appear on every ridge. The camp wasn't much. A low stone cabin with a roof of ocotillo ribs, a livestock pen, and a well with a bucket that clanked every time the wind gusted. Silas dismounted and helped the girls down, then drew a bucket of water. It came up cold and clear, the metal rim smooth from years of use. He set out cornmeal, a sack of dried beans, some salt pork. Naylin watched him move through the camp, her eyes tracking every gesture. You live alone? She asked. Mostly. Run cattle for a ranch outfit up north. They pay me to keep an eye on water sources out here. And he nodded toward this well. This one's the best in 50 miles. Nayland knelt beside the well, ran her hand along the stone rim. Apache know this water. Long time. Figured as much. She looked up at him, and for the first time, something in her expression softened. Not trust, not yet, but maybe the edge of it. Kern say we abandon land, she said. Say we run away, so land is his now. He has paper that says so. Silas felt his jaw tighten. And the hanging? Make sure we run. Make sure we do not come back. He thought about the fresh rope fibers in his pocket, about the way Kern's name had been whispered in town, like a man who didn't just have power, he was power. Well, Silas said slowly, reckon he's going to be surprised when he finds out you're still here. Nayland's mouth curved, not quite a smile. Yes, he will be. The next afternoon, Silas rode into town for supplies. He needed cornmeal, bandages, and enough salt pork to stretch a week. The general store smelled like leather and tobacco, and the floor creaked under his boots as he set his list on the counter. Murphy, the storekeeper, read it without looking up. Then he slid the paper back across the wood. Can't serve you, Crow. Silas blinked. What? You heard me. Murphy's voice was flat, his eyes fixed somewhere past Silas's shoulder. Store policy. Since when? Since you started harboring federal fugitives. Murphy finally met his gaze, and Silas saw something there he didn't like. Fear, maybe? Or the kind of calculation a man makes when he's weighing his own neck. Kern's got eyes everywhere, and he's posted bounty, $50 a head. Silas felt the air go thin. $50. Each? That's $350 worth of trouble you're sitting on, Crow. Murphy leaned forward, voice dropping. You're a smart man. Do the math. And behind him, Silas heard the murmur of other customers. Men he'd known for years. Men who'd bought him drinks and asked his opinion on water sources and cattle routes. Now they just stared, silent, like he'd sprouted horns. Silas picked up his coins, slid them back into his pocket. His hand brushed against the rope fibers, and he pulled one out, held it up to the light. Murphy's eyes flicked to it, then away. This hemp, Silas said slowly. You sell rope like this? I sell all kinds of rope. Yeah, but not this kind. Silas nodded toward the spool hanging behind the counter. Different weave. Coarser. This here's new stock. 3-strand twist, real tight. You know where a man might buy it? Murphy's face went pale. Get out of my store, Crow. Silas turned and walked toward the door. Just before he stepped into the sunlight, he heard Murphy mutter under his breath. Kern's gonna hang you right alongside him. Doc Emmett Gale arrived at the line camp just after nightfall, his medical bag slung over one shoulder and a glass plate camera tucked under his arm. Silas met him at the door, grateful for the company and the expertise both. Heard you had patience, Doc said, his voice low and gravelly. He was 65 if he was a day, with hands that shook slightly from old age but steadied the moment they touched a wound. 7 of them. Silas stepped aside to let him in. The girls were arranged around the fireplace. Wrapped in blankets Silas had pulled from his own bedroll, Nayland sat upright, watchful, while her sisters dozed in fits and starts. The smell of mesquite smoke filled the small cabin, mixing with the metallic tang of the well water Silas had been using to clean their rope burns. Doc set his bag down and knelt beside the youngest girl first. He didn't speak, just moved with the careful efficiency of a man who'd seen too much suffering to waste time on pleasantries. He examined each neck wound under the light of a lantern, his fingers gentle but thorough. After the 5th girl, he pulled out his camera and started photographing the injuries. The flash powder hissed and popped, filling the room with acrid smoke. Why pictures? Nayland asked, her eyes narrowed. Doc looked up at her, his expression grim. Because when Kern's lawyer stands up in court and claims you girls tried to hang yourselves, I'm going to have science that says otherwise. He moved to Nayland last, tilting her chin up to catch the lantern light on her throat. The bruising was deep, mottled purple and black, with the clear impression of rope fibers still visible in her skin. These burns were made while your heart was beating, Doc said quietly, pulling out a small notebook and sketching the pattern. Ante-mortem, you understand what that means? Nayland's jaw tightened. It means someone wanted us to suffer awake. Well, it means, Doc said, meeting her eyes, that this wasn't a warning. It was attempted murder. The room went silent, except for the crackle of the fire. Silas felt something cold and hard settle in his chest, the kind of anger that didn't explode. It calcified. Doc packed up his equipment and stood, brushing the dust off his knees. How much trouble are you in, Silas? Don't know yet. Murphy wouldn't sell me supplies this afternoon, said Kern's posted bounty. 50 a head, Doc confirmed. Whole town's talking about it. Kern made the announcement himself at the saloon this morning. Silas glanced at Nayland. Her face was unreadable, but her hands were clenched tight in the blanket. "What else did he say?" Silas asked. Doc hesitated, then sighed. "That you need to hear it yourself. He's holding court again tomorrow at 11, courthouse steps." The crowd outside the saloon was thick enough that Silas had to elbow his way to the window. Inside, Thaddeus Kern stood at the bar like a man holding court, a rolled parchment in one hand and a whiskey in the other. He was tall, well-dressed, with the kind of face that looked trustworthy, until you noticed the coldness in his eyes. "Gentlemen," Kern said, his voice carrying easily over the murmur of the crowd, "I appreciate your patience as we resolve this unfortunate matter." He unrolled the parchment with a flourish, and Silas saw the federal seal stamped at the top, bold, official, impossible to argue with. "This," Kern continued, "is a writ of abandonment, signed and sealed by the United States Department of the Interior. It declares that the Apache tribe in question has voluntarily vacated their ancestral lands, thereby forfeiting all claims to water rights, mineral deposits, and territorial jurisdiction." A few men in the crowd nodded, others shifted uncomfortably. "Now," Kern said, his tone sharpening, "I understand there's been some confusion. 7 Apache girls were found yesterday near Gallows Ridge. These individuals are federal fugitives under the Indian Removal Act. Any person harboring them is, by definition, obstructing federal law." Silas felt every eye in the room turn toward the window. He didn't move. Kern's gaze found him through the glass, and a slow smile spread across his face. "Mr. Crow, how good of you to join us." The crowd parted as Silas stepped inside. The saloon smelled like sweat and whiskey, and the floorboards groaned under his boots. He stopped a few feet from Kern, close enough to see the ink smudges on the man's fingers. "That writ," Silas said, nodding toward the parchment. "When was it signed?" Kern's smile didn't falter. 4 years ago, August 12th, 1872, witnessed and notarized at dawn, as required by federal statute." Silas studied the document. The handwriting was neat, the seal intact. But something about it nagged at him, the edges too crisp, the ink too dark for something supposedly 4 years old. "And you're telling me those girls abandoned their land 4 years ago?" Silas said slowly. "That's precisely what I'm telling you." "Funny. They seem to remember it different." Kern's expression hardened. "Mr. Crow, I'm a federal Indian Affairs Commissioner. My authority supersedes local law, territorial law, and whatever misguided sense of chivalry you think you're exercising. Those girls are fugitives. You have 24 hours to turn them over, or you'll be charged with obstruction and conspiracy." The room went dead silent. Silas felt the weight of every man's stare, some sympathetic, most just afraid. "And if I don't?" Silas asked. Kern leaned in close, his voice dropping to a whisper that still carried. "Then you hang beside them. That's U.S. law, Mr. Crow, not my law, not territorial law, federal." He straightened, addressing the crowd again. "I'm a reasonable man. I don't want bloodshed. I want compliance. So I'm offering a bounty, $50 per fugitive, paid upon delivery to federal custody. That's $350, gentlemen, enough to see a man through winter." Silas looked around the room. He saw hunger in some faces, fear in others. But mostly, he saw men who'd already made their choice. Kern raised his whiskey glass. "To justice." The crowd echoed him, voices hollow. Silas turned and walked out. Behind him, he heard Kern's laughter, low and confident, like a man who'd already won. Outside, the sun was brutal and unforgiving. Silas stood on the courthouse steps and stared at the writ Kern had posted beside the saloon door. The timestamp caught his eye. 4:47 a.m., August 12th, 1872. He frowned. Something about that number felt wrong, but he couldn't place it yet. Doc Gale appeared at his elbow, his face lined with worry. "You just made an enemy of the federal government, son." "Reckon I did," Silas said. "Question is, what are you going to do about it?" Silas pulled the rope fiber from his pocket, studied it in the sunlight. Fresh hemp. Bought within the last week, if he had to guess. I'm going to prove he's a liar," Silas said, one way or another. Back at the line camp, Silas sat at the rough-hewn table and opened his ranch ledger. The pages were worn, corners bent from years of use, and every line represented something. Cattle bought, sold, branded, lost to drought or wolves. 60 head total, 10 years of work, give or take. He ran his finger down the columns until he found the number he was looking for. $1,800. That's what the herd was worth at current market prices. Not a fortune, but enough to keep a man fed and sheltered through old age. Nalin appeared in the doorway, silent as smoke. She'd washed the dust from her face, and in the lamplight, Silas could see how young she really was. 19, maybe 20. "You count your cows?" she asked. "Countin' what I'm about to lose." Silas turned the ledger so she could see it. "If Kern takes you girls, I'll need money for lawyers, appeals. That kind of thing costs." Nalin stepped closer, her eyes scanning the numbers. She touched one entry, 60 head, 2,800, and looked up at him. You trade 10 winners of work for 7 lives? Seems like a fair trade to me. She was quiet for a long moment, her hand resting on the ledger, like she was trying to understand the weight of it. Then she placed her palm flat over the number, a gesture that felt deliberate, binding. Apache do not forget debts, she said. Silas closed the book. Ain't a debt, it's a choice. Nolan studied him, that sharp, simmering anger still in her eyes but tempered now with something else. Curiosity, maybe, or the beginning of trust. You want to help? She asked. I show you something. They walked out to the well, just as the sun dropped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of copper and rust. The evening air was cooler, carrying the scent of creosote and dust. Nalen's sisters followed, arranging themselves in a loose circle around the wellhead. Your metal tools, Nalen said, pointing to the surveyor's rods Silas kept propped against the cabin wall. They find water. Sometimes. When the ground's right. Bring them. Silas fetched the rods, 2 L-shaped pieces of iron that were supposed to cross when you walked over in Siam, underground spring. He'd used them a handful of times with mixed results. Mostly he relied on reading the land, where cottonwoods grew, where the ground stayed damp. Nolan gestured toward a patch of open ground 30 feet from the well. Walk there. Tell me what you find. Silas held the rods loosely in his hands and paced across the hardpan. They stayed parallel, inert. He tried again, focusing, slowing his steps. Nothing. There's no water here, he said. Nalen smiled, just a flicker. Now watch. She pulled a knife from her belt and walked to a stand of scrub willow growing near the livestock pen. With 2 quick cuts, she shaped a Y-shaped branch, the wood still green and springy. She stripped the bark from the handles and held the fork out in front of her, gripping each arm of the Y with her palms up. Then she walked. The branch dipped violently, pulling downward like something had grabbed it from below. Nalen stopped, marked the spot with her heel and looked back at Silas. Dig, she said. Silas grabbed a shovel. 3 feet down, the earth turned damp. At 4 feet, water began to seep into the hole. At 5, it was pooling fast enough that he had to step back. I'll be damned, he muttered. Nolan handed him the willow branch. Now you try. The wood felt alive in his hands, warm and flexible. He walked toward the spot where his iron rods had failed, holding the willow the way Nolan had shown him. For the first few steps, nothing happened. Then, the branch jerked downward so hard it nearly pulled out of his grip. He stumbled, caught himself, and stared at the ground beneath his boots. There's water here? He said, astonished. Yes. Nalen crouched beside him, her fingers tracing patterns in the dust. Apache know this land, know every spring, every hidden place. White men use metal ears, cannot hear, but land speaks, always. Silas looked at the willow branch in his hands, then at Nolan. Kern says you abandoned this place. Says you ran. We do not run. Her voice was hard as stone. We are taken, by rope, by fear. But land remembers, water remembers. One of the younger sisters, couldn't have been more than 12, stepped forward and knelt beside the damp earth. She scooped a handful of mud, pressed it between her palms, and began to hum. Low and rhythmic, almost like a prayer. Silas felt something tighten in his chest. He'd heard that melody before, 12 years ago, in a place he tried not to think about. A woman's voice, fading as the smoke cleared. He shook the memory away and focused on the present, on the willow branch, still trembling in his hands. Could you do this in front of a judge? He asked Nalen. She tilted her head, considering. If judge has eyes to see. Then we got ourselves a piece of evidence. And Silas stuck the willow branch in the ground, marking the spot. You can prove you know this land better than any surveyor Kern's got. Prove you never abandoned it. Nalen's expression shifted. Hope, fragile and uncertain, but there. You think white man's court listens to Apache girl? I think, Silas said slowly, that a man who's willing to hang 7 people over water rights ain't gonna stop until somebody makes him. And I reckon the law is the only thing bigger than a federal writ. Nalen looked at her sisters, then back at Silas. We try. But if law does not listen, then we'll find another way. The youngest sister finished her humming and stood, mud still caked on her hands. She walked to Silas and pressed her palm against his, leaving a wet imprint. Nalen translated softly. She says you have honest hands, not like the land thief. Silas looked down at the mud drying on his skin. For the first time in a long time, he felt like maybe, just maybe, he was doing something right. The next morning, Silas rode into town for the courthouse hearing. Kern had made it a public spectacle, posted notices on every corner, called in witnesses, even arranged for the territorial judge to preside. The courthouse steps were packed with men in dusty hats and women fanning themselves against the heat. Silas tied his horse and pushed through the crowd. The smell of sweat and tobacco was thick enough to choke on. and the murmur of voices died as he passed. He spotted Doc Gale near the front, holding a leather satchel that bulged with photographic plates. On the top step, Thaddeus Kern stood beside Reverend Amos Lyle, both men dressed like they were attending a funeral. The Reverend clutched a Bible to his chest, his face pale and sheened with sweat despite the morning cool. Judge Harlow, a territorial appointee with a face like a dried apple, banged his gavel on a makeshift podium. Order, we're here to settle the matter of land abandonment pursuant to federal statute. Mr. Kern, you may present your case. Kern stepped forward, unrolling his writ with practiced ease. Your Honor, this document was executed on August 12, 1872 at 4:40 in the morning. Reverend Lyle witnessed the Apache tribe's voluntary departure from the disputed territory as per the Indian Removal Act. Their failure to maintain occupancy for a period exceeding 4 years constitutes legal abandonment. He held the writ up for the crowd to see. The federal seal gleamed in the sunlight. Reverend, Judge Harlow said, you witnessed this. Lyle's throat worked. Yes, Your Honor. I witnessed the signing. At dawn, Silas's jaw tightened. Something about the way Lyle said it, too rehearsed, like a man reciting lines he didn't believe. Kern continued, his voice smooth as whiskey. Furthermore, 7 Apache fugitives were located on said abandoned land in direct violation of federal relocation orders. I hereby request this court's assistance in remanding them to federal custody. Judge Harlow stamped the writ without hesitation. Granted. Land transfer approved. Federal authority supersedes territorial jurisdiction. The crowd murmured approval. A few men nodded, satisfied. Silas felt the ground shift beneath him. He'd known it was a long shot. But seeing it happen, watching the judge's stamp come down like an executioner's axe, made it real. Doc Gale stepped forward, his voice cutting through the noise. Your Honor, I have medical evidence suggesting those girls were victims of attempted murder, not fugitives. Medical evidence doesn't supersede federal law, Doctor. But it does speak to intent. If Mr. Kern ordered, enough, Judge Harlow waved his hand dismissively. The writ is valid. This matter is closed. Kern's smile was sharp and cold. He turned to address the crowd. I'm a reasonable man. I don't want violence, but I do want compliance. 24 hours, gentlemen. After that, anyone harboring fugitives will be arrested for obstruction of justice. Silas started to push forward, to say something, anything, but a hand gripped his arm. Jacob. His younger brother stood there in a duster coat and gunbelt, his face shadowed beneath a wide-brimmed hat. Silas hadn't seen him in 2 years, not since Jacob had taken work with a freight company running goods between Santa Fe and Tucson. Jake, Silas said, his voice low, what are you doing here? Jacob didn't answer. He just jerked his head toward the edge of the crowd, where a dozen men waited on horseback, all wearing the same gun belts, the same hard expressions. Kern's men. No, Silas breathed. Jacob's jaw tightened, but he didn't look away. I got a job, Silas, same as you. A job? You're working for him? Mary's sick, doctors cost money, Kern pays $50 a month. Silas felt something break open inside his chest. Not anger, not yet, just a hollow, aching disbelief. So you're going to help him hang 7 girls because your wife needs medicine? Jacob flinched. It ain't like that. Then what's it like, Jake? Before Jacob could answer, Kern descended the courthouse steps with the writ tucked under his arm. He clapped Jacob on the shoulder like they were old friends. Mr. Crow, Kern said, his tone pleasant. Your brother's been a valuable asset, reliable, professional, unlike some members of your family. And Silas's fists clenched. You son of a... Kern raised a finger. Federal authority, remember? Strike me, and you're assaulting a government official. That's a hanging offense. Jacob stepped between them, his hand hovering near his revolver. Silas, don't. Listen to your brother, Kern said, his smile widening. He's got more sense than you do. But Silas looked at Jacob, really looked at him, saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the way his hand shook just slightly before he steadied it, saw the boy he'd pulled out of a well when they were kids, the one who'd cried on his shoulder when their mother died. And now that same boy stood between him and justice, a hired gun for a man who'd tried to murder 7 people. You got one day, Silas, Kern said, turning away. After that, we come for you and the girls. Federal warrant, no trial, just rope. He mounted his horse and rode off, his men falling in behind him. Jacob lingered for a moment, his face twisted with something that might have been shame or regret, or just exhaustion. I'm sorry, Jacob said quietly. No, you ain't, Silas replied. If you were, you wouldn't be wearing his belt. Jacob's mouth opened, then closed. He turned and followed Kern's riders, dust rising in their wake. Silas stood on the courthouse steps long after the crowd dispersed. The sun climbed higher, baking the stone beneath his boots, and the smell of horse dung and sweat hung in the air like a curse. Doc Gale approached, his face grim. That writ's airtight, Silas. Federal seal, witness testimony, judge's approval. We can't fight it head on. Then we go around it. Silas pulled the rope fiber from his pocket again, turning it over in the light. This hemp's new, bought within the last week. You said Kern's writ was signed 4 years ago? That's what it says. Then how'd he know to buy rope for a hanging 3 days before he found those girls? Doc's eyes narrowed. You think he planned it? I think, Silas said slowly, that a man don't buy fresh rope unless he knows he's going to need it. And I think we got 24 hours to prove it. Behind them, the courthouse door creaked shut. The sound echoed like a coffin lid closing. The ride back to the line camp felt longer than it should have. Silas kept seeing Jacob's face, the way his brother's hand had hovered near that revolver, the exhaustion in his eyes, the shame he'd tried to hide. By the time the stone cabin came into view, the sun was past its peak, and Silas's anger had cooled into something harder, something he could use. Nolan met him at the door. She read his face before he said a word. The court did not listen, she said. It wasn't a question. No, they stamped Kern's writ. We got 1 day before he comes with guns. The other sisters gathered behind Nolan, their faces drawn but resolute. The youngest clutched the willow branch from yesterday, still green and supple in her small hands. Then we run, one of the middle sisters said in Apache. Nayland translated without taking her eyes off Silas. We could, Silas said. Mexico's 3 days south if you push hard, but Kern's got men. They'll track you. And even if you make it across the border, you'll never come home. Home is gone, Nolan said quietly. Kern has paper that says so. Paper can be wrong. Silas stepped inside and pulled his ranch ledger from the shelf. I need to show you something. And as he spread the ledger on the table, 10 years of entries, every cow accounted for, every transaction documented, his entire life reduced to columns of numbers and dates. This herd is worth $1,800, he said. It's all I got. No wife, no kids, just cattle and land I don't even own. He looked at Nolan. But it can buy us time. Lawyers, appeals, a way to fight Kern that don't involve running or dying. Nalen's brow furrowed. You give your cows to save us? Not give. Use as collateral. Doc Gale's a good man. He'll hold the deed. If Kern takes you before we can prove that writ's a fraud, Doc sells the herd and uses the money to keep fighting. If we win, Silas shrugged, I get my cows back. One of the older sisters spoke rapidly in Apache, her voice rising. Nolan listened, then translated. She says white men do not sacrifice for Apache. She says you want something. I want, Silas said carefully, to not live in a world where a man can hang 7 people and call it legal. That worth something to you? Nolan studied him for a long moment. Then she placed her hand over the ledger, the same deliberate gesture from before. If you do this, you are not alone anymore. You understand? Apache remember debts. Apache protect family.
I ain't family.
You will be. She said it with such certainty that Silas didn't know how to argue. Esther Voss arrived just before sunset, her buckboard wagon rattling up the trail with the notary riding beside her. She was 52, rail-thin, with hands that looked like they'd been carved from the same desert stone as her ranch house. Her late husband had been a surveyor, one of the few white men the Apache had trusted. Heard you're about to do something stupid, she said, climbing down from the wagon. Seems to be my habit lately, Silas replied. Esther pulled a leather case from beneath the wagon seat and set it on the table with a heavy thunk. Inside was a roll of parchment so old the edges had gone brittle, the wax seal cracked but still intact. This, she said, unrolling it carefully, is the original land grant for this territory. Signed in 1852 by the Mexican government before the U.S. ever set foot here. My husband surveyed these water sources for the Mexican authorities, and they granted usage rights to the Apache tribes in perpetuity. Silas leaned closer. The document was written in Spanish. The ink faded to brown, but the seal was unmistakable. A Mexican eagle, pressed into red wax. This says the Apache got legal claim to the water? Silas asked. It says, Esther corrected, that the water rights predate United States jurisdiction by 24 years. Kern's federal writ don't mean spit if this land was never legally U.S. property to begin with. Doc Gale let out a low whistle. That's a hell of a loophole. It's more than a loophole, Esther said. It's a legitimate legal claim. Problem is, most judges won't want to hear it. Goes against federal authority. Makes them look weak. So we need proof they can't ignore, Silas said. Esther nodded toward Nolan. That willow branch trick you showed him, can you do it in court? In front of witnesses? Nalen's jaw set. Yes, good. Because if you can prove generational knowledge of this land, Prove your people have been stewards here, longer than the U.S. government's even existed. Then Kern's abandonment claim falls apart. Esther tapped the old deed. This document supports your testimony. Together it might be enough. Silas looked at Doc Gale. You think Judge Harlow will listen? Not willingly, Doc admitted. But if we present evidence in public, with enough witnesses, he can't just ignore it. Territorial law says any party can request a land dispute hearing. We file a counterclaim tomorrow morning. We buy ourselves time. Time for what? Nayland asked. Doc pulled a small vial from his medical bag, clear liquid that smelled sharp and chemical. Time for me to test that ink on Kern's writ. My friend in Santa Fe is a chemist. He can date ink oxidation within 6 months' margin of error. If Kern's document was really signed in 1872, the ink should be degraded. But if it's fresh, he let the implication hang. Then we prove he forged it, Silas finished. Esther set a second document on the table, a livestock deed, blank except for Silas's name at the top. You sure about this, Crow? You sign this, you're putting everything on the line. Silas picked up the pen. His hand didn't shake. Reckon I already put everything on the line the moment I cut those ropes. He signed his name in slow, deliberate strokes. Doc Gale and Esther witnessed it, and the notary stamped it official. 60 head of cattle, transferred to Doc's custody as collateral, 10 years of work, gone in 30 seconds. Nellen watched the whole thing in silence. When it was done, she walked to the door and looked out at the darkening desert. If we lose, she said quietly, Kern takes everything, your cows, our lives, this land. Then we don't lose, Silas said. She turned back to him, and in the fading light, he saw something in her expression that hadn't been there before. Not trust, not quite, but the beginning of belief. Tomorrow, she said, we fight. Silas woke before dawn to the sound of hammering. He pulled on his boots and stepped outside to find the town square, transformed. Kern had posted handbills on every building, crude prints on cheap paper, still wet with ink. Silas Crow, traitor, ex-cavalry deserter, fled Sand Creek Massacre, 1864, now harbors federal. Fugitives. The words hit him like fists, half-truths twisted into lies. He hadn't deserted. He'd mustered out 3 days after Sand Creek, sickened by what he'd seen. But the handbill made it sound like he'd run under fire, left his brothers to die. A woman crossed the street to avoid him. 2 men spat in the dust as he passed. By the time Silas reached the general store, a crowd had gathered, reading the handbills and muttering. Murphy stood in his doorway, arms crossed. Told you Kern had eyes everywhere. Silas tore down his nearest handbill. The ink smudged under his thumb, fresh, still tacky. He held it up to the morning light and noticed something. The typeface. The paper stock. Identical to the copy of Kern's writ that had been posted beside the saloon. Same printing press. Same ink batch. Doc Gale appeared at his elbow, his face grim. He's trying to turn the whole town against you before the hearing. It's working. Silas folded the handbill and tucked it in his pocket. But he made a mistake. What kind of mistake? Silas pulled out the smudged handbill and the writ copy side by side. Look at the ink. Same color, same texture. If this handbill's fresh, and we know it is because I just watched him post it, then that writ's got the same fresh ink on it. Doc's eyes narrowed. You think the writ's a recent forgery? I think a document that's supposed to be 4 years old shouldn't bleed when you touch it. I know a man in Santa Fe, Doc said slowly. Territorial chemist. Works with the marshal's office. He can test ink oxidation, date it within 6 months. How fast can he get here? If I ride hard, 2 days. We got one. Doc nodded. Then I'll send a telegram. Get him on the next stage. Meanwhile, we need to file that counterclaim before Kern's deadline expires. They walked to the courthouse together, the morning sun already brutal on the back of Silas's neck. Inside, the clerk, a nervous man named Stillwell, looked up from his ledger and immediately looked back down. Need to file a land dispute claim, Silas said. Court's closed to new filings. Judge's orders. Since when? Since this morning. Stillwell wouldn't meet his eyes. Kern's authority supersedes. Territorial law says any party can dispute a land transfer within 30 days of the original filing, Doc interrupted. That's statute, not subject to Judge Harlow's discretion. Stillwell's hands trembled as he pulled out the proper forms. You're going to get me fired. You're going to get yourself fired if you violate territorial statute, Doc said flatly. They filled out the paperwork, Doc's handwriting neat and precise, Silas's rougher but legible. When they were done, Stillwell stamped it with visible reluctance and slid it into the filing box. Hearing set for tomorrow, he muttered. 10 o'clock. Judge won't be happy. Neither am I, Silas said. They rode out to Esther Voss's ranch that afternoon. Her spread was 30 miles east, tucked into a canyon where a year-round creek still ran despite the drought. Her late husband's surveying office had been converted into a storage room, but the records were all still there, meticulously organized in wooden file boxes, each labeled by year and territory. Esther pulled down the box marked 1850, 1855, and set it on a workbench. Samuel kept everything: ink receipts, supply manifests, correspondence with the Mexican authorities. If we can cross-reference the ink batch on Kern's writ with Samuel's records, we can prove when it was really made. Doc opened the box and started sifting through papers. Receipts for surveying equipment, payment vouchers, and there, a folder labeled Tintas y Suministros, inks and supplies. Inside were detailed records of every ink purchase Samuel Voss had made between 1850 and his death in 1873. Each entry included the supplier, the batch number, and the chemical composition. Santa Fe Trading Company, Doc read aloud, supplied ink to most of the territory between 1850 and 1870. They stamped batch numbers on every bottle, year and month of manufacture. So if we can see the batch number on Kern's writ, Silas said, we can prove whether it's really from 1872 or if it's a recent forgery. Doc closed the folder carefully. Problem is, we need to examine the original document, not a copy. Kern's got the original, Esther said. He's not going to hand it over. Then we make him. Doc pulled out a legal pad and started writing. We subpoena the document as evidence for the counterclaim. Judge has to compel him to produce it for examination. Silas looked at the shelves of records. Decades of meticulous work, all pointing toward one conclusion. Samuel trusted the Apache, he said to Esther. Why? Her expression softened. Winter of 1859. Samuel got caught in a blizzard while surveying the northern ridges. Would have frozen to death if an Apache woman hadn't found him. She brought him back to her village, kept him alive for 3 days until the weather broke. You know her name? He called her the grandmother, said she sang to him the whole time. Kept him awake when he wanted to sleep. Esther's voice cracked slightly. He said she saved his life with a song. Silas felt the air leave his lungs. A lullaby? Yes. How did you... Before Esther could finish, the sound of boots on the porch made them all turn. The door swung open, and Reverend Amos Lyle stood there, swaying slightly, his face streaked with tears. I lied, he said, his voice breaking. God forgive me, I lied. Doc stood slowly. Reverend? Lyle stumbled inside and collapsed into a chair. His hands shook so badly he had to clasp them together to keep them still. Kern paid me $200 to witness that writ signing. Said it was just paperwork, said nobody would get hurt. But it wasn't dawn, it was full dark. 4 in the morning, maybe earlier. I didn't even see the sun till an hour after I signed. Silas stepped forward. You're saying the writ wasn't signed at dawn like it claims? It wasn't signed at dawn. It wasn't even signed in 1872. Lyle pulled a crumpled envelope from his coat and threw it on the table. I kept the payment receipt, dated 3 weeks ago. Kern paid me to backdate my testimony. Doc picked up the envelope. Inside was a bank draft from the Territorial Bank of Santa Fe, dated August 1876. Payment to Reverend Amos Lyle, $200. Memo line, consultation services. Why are you telling us this? Esther asked. Lyle's face crumpled. Because I can't sleep. Because every time I close my eyes, I see those girls hanging from that tree. Because Kern told me it was just to scare them into leaving, but now he's coming back with guns, and, he buried his face in his hands. I'm damned already. Might as well tell the truth. Doc set the bank draft down carefully. You'll testify to this? In court? I'll testify to everything. The backdate, the payment, the fact that Kern's writ is a fraud from top to bottom. Lyle looked up, his eyes red and desperate. Will it be enough? It's a start, Silas said. But we're going to need more. Doc pulled out his telegram draft and added a note. If the chemist can confirm the ink's fresh and you testify the signature was backdated, and we can prove the Apache have generational knowledge of the water sources. He looked at Esther. That 1852 deed might actually hold up. Esther nodded slowly. Samuel always said the law was only as good as the men enforcing it. Let's hope Judge Harlow's better than Kern thinks. Silas looked at the Reverend, then at the bank draft, then at the boxes of records lining Esther's shelves. Piece by piece, they were building a case. But Kern had guns, and 24 hours was almost up. That night, back at the line camp, Silas sat by the fire while Nolan's sisters slept inside the cabin. The mesquite smoke curled up into the darkness, and the coyotes sang their distant songs. Nellen sat across from him, sharpening a knife against a whetstone. The rhythmic scrape of metal on stone the only sound between them. Tomorrow we go to court, she said without looking up. You think Judge listens this time? I think we got a better chance than we did yesterday. Better chance is not certainty. The knife paused mid-stroke. White man's law is made to protect white men, not Apache. Silas didn't argue. He'd seen enough to know she was right more often than not. Nayland set the knife down and looked at him across the flames. You hum sometimes. When you think no one hears. He went still. Apache song, she continued. Lullaby my grandmother sang. I hear you yesterday. When you plant the willow branch. Same melody. Silas's throat tightened. He'd been careful for 12 years not to hum that tune where anyone could hear, but out here, with the desert wind and the crackling fire, he must have let his guard down. How you know that song? Nolan asked, her voice soft but insistent. He could lie, should lie, probably. But sitting here with 7 lives depending on him, with the weight of Esther's deed and Doc's evidence and Reverend Lyle's confession, all stacked like kindling. Waiting for a spark, he found he didn't have any lies left. Sand Creek, he said finally. Colorado Territory, November 1864. Nolan's hand moved to the knife, not threatening, just instinctive. I was cavalry, Silas continued. 26 years old, followed orders. We rode into a peaceful camp at dawn. Old men, women, children. They had a white flag up, didn't matter. His voice went flat, distant. I heard a woman singing while the smoke cleared. Apache woman, holding a child. She was dying, but she kept singing, that lullaby, trying to keep the child calm. The fire popped. Sparks rose into the night. I didn't shoot her, Silas said quickly. Didn't shoot anyone that day, if I'm honest. Just sat on my horse and watched it happen. Which maybe makes me worse. I don't know. But I heard that song, and 3 days later, I turned in my commission and walked away. Been hearing it ever since. Nolan was silent for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. That woman was my grandmother. Silas's head snapped up. She went to Colorado to visit her sister's family. Was supposed to come home after one moon. Nayland's eyes were wet, but her voice stayed steady. She never came home, we heard later. Sand Creek. Whole camp killed. Nayland, you did not kill her. And Ellen's words cut through his apology. You did not stop it, but you did not kill her. You heard her song. You remembered. She leaned forward, the firelight catching the tears on her cheeks. Do you know what that song says? Silas shook his head. It says, even in darkness, the morning comes. Even in dying, we sing life. My grandmother sang it to me when I was small. Before Sand Creek, before Kern, before the ropes. Nolan's hand moved to her throat, touching the rope burn there. She sang it when she died because she believed it. Morning comes. Silas felt something break open in his chest. Not guilt, not anymore. Something raw, grief maybe, or grace. When you cut our ropes, Nayland said, you were not just saving us, you were answering her song. 12 years late, but you answered. I don't deserve. It is not about deserve. Nayland stood and crossed to his side of the fire. She placed her hand on his chest, over his heart, the same gesture she'd made with the ledger. Grandmother's song does not curse, it blesses. You carry it. Now you carry us. That is how debt is paid. Not with money, but with remembering. Silas couldn't speak. Couldn't do anything but sit there, while this girl, this woman who'd been hanged and left for dead, told him he was forgiven for something he'd never forgiven himself for. Tomorrow, Nayland said, when we go to court, I will sing Grandmother's song. Let the judge hear it. Let Kern hear it. Let them know we do not abandon. We do not forget. We remember. She returned to her side of the fire and picked up the knife again. The scrape of metal on stone resumed, steady and sure. Silas sat in the smoke and the firelight, and for the first time in 12 years, he hummed the lullaby out loud. Nolan joined him, their voices weaving together in the darkness. Before dawn, they gathered at the church, the only building in town big enough to hold what they needed. Doc Gale had spent the night organizing evidence. His medical photographs, Esther's 1852 deed, Reverend Lyle's bank receipt, and the rope fibers Silas had kept since that first day. On the table, laid out like pieces of a puzzle, was everything they had. The chemist won't make it in time, Doc said, exhaustion lining his face. Telegraph says his stage broken axle 20 miles out. He'll be here tomorrow at the earliest. Then we go without him, Silas said. We've got circumstantial evidence, Reverend's testimony, the old deed, but without chemical proof that the ink's fresh. We've got proof Kern can't fake. Silas looked at Nayland. Show them. Nolan unwrapped the willow divining rod from its cloth. In the dim church light, it looked like what it was, just a forked branch. But in her hands, it became something more. A connection to the land that went back generations. Back before writs and federal seals and men, like Kern, who thought paper was stronger than memory. There's one more thing, Esther said. She pulled out a leather journal, Samuel's field notes from 1852. He documented the water sources in this territory, and he included sketches. Look. She opened to a page marked with a ribbon. The sketch showed the exact location of the underground spring beneath the courthouse, The same spring Nalene had found with the willow branch. Samuel learned the location from the Apache, Esther said. He wrote here, "The grandmother showed me the hidden waters, said her people have known them for 10 generations. This knowledge is their birthright." Doc set his hand on the journal. "If we can prove in court that Nalin has the same knowledge Samuel documented 24 years ago, knowledge that can only come from generational teaching, then we prove continuous occupancy." Kern's abandonment claim collapses. "And if the judge don't care?" Silas asked. "Then we make him care." Doc pulled out one more document, a telegram from the territorial marshal's office. "I contacted the marshal about Kern's attempted murder. They're sending a deputy to observe the hearing. Federal authority or not, if we can prove Kern tried to kill 7 people to steal land, the marshal's office will intervene." Silas looked at the evidence spread across the table. Medical photos of rope burns, an ancient deed written in Spanish, a bank receipt proving perjury, a willow branch, and a song. "It's not enough," he said quietly. "It's all we have," Doc replied. Reverend Lyle stood in the doorway, his Bible clutched to his chest. "Then we pray it's enough." The church bell tolled 5 times. Dawn was coming, and with it, judgment. By the time the sun cleared the eastern ridges, the courthouse steps were packed. Seemed like the whole territory had turned out. Ranchers, shopkeepers, drifters, even a few Apache from neighboring tribes who'd heard what was happening. The air smelled like dust and sweat and tension. Thaddeus Kern stood at the top of the steps in a fresh suit, his federal writ rolled up like a weapon. Beside him, 12 armed men formed a line, Jacob among them, his face hidden beneath his hat brim. Judge Harlow took his seat behind a makeshift bench, his gavel already in hand. "This is a land dispute hearing, not a trial. We're here to determine if Mr. Crow's counterclaim has merit. Mr. Kern, you may begin." Kern stepped forward, smooth as silk. "Your Honor, my position is simple. The Apache tribe abandoned this territory in 1872, as documented by federal writ and witness testimony. Any claim to the contrary is an attempt to undermine United States authority." "And yet," Doc Gale said, rising from the crowd, "we have evidence suggesting your writ is fraudulent." The crowd murmured. Kern's smile didn't falter. "Bold accusation, Doctor. Do you have proof?" Doc gestured to Reverend Lyle, who stood shakily and made his way to the front. His face was pale, his hands trembling, but his voice carried. "I was paid $200 to witness Mr. Kern's writ," Lyle said, 3 weeks ago, not in 1872. "He told me to backdate my testimony." The crowd erupted. Judge Harlow banged his gavel. "Order!" Kern's expression darkened. "The Reverend is mistaken. Grief does strange things to a man's memory. I kept the receipt." Lyle pulled the bank draft from his pocket and handed it to the judge. Dated August 1876. Payment for false witness. Judge Harlow examined the receipt, his jaw working. "This is troubling." "It's perjury," Doc said flatly. "And if the writ was backdated, then the abandonment claim is void." Kern's voice sharpened. "One man's confession doesn't prove anything. My writ bears a federal seal. It was properly executed according to territorial statute." "At 4:47 in the morning," Silas interrupted. Stepping forward, he pulled a small book from his coat, an astronomical almanac. "According to this, sunrise on August 12, 1872 was at 5:23 a.m. Federal law requires daylight witness for land transfer documents. Your writ was allegedly signed 36 minutes before legal sunrise." The crowd went silent. Kern's smile finally cracked. "That's a technicality." "It's the law," Doc said. "Your law, Mr. Kern. The one you've been hiding behind this whole time." Judge Harlow set the almanac down slowly. "Kern, can you explain the timestamp discrepancy?" Kern's hand moved toward the inside of his coat, then stopped. "Clerical error. The notary must have—" "I have more," Doc interrupted. He pulled out the medical photographs and laid them on the bench. "These are images of rope burns on the 7 Apache girls, ante-mortem injuries, inflicted while they were alive and conscious. The rope fibers found at the scene match a purchase made from the Santa Fe Trading Company 3 days before the girls were discovered." He placed a ledger beside the photos. "This is the company's sales log. August 15th, 1876, 50 feet of 3-strand hemp rope sold to Thaddeus Kern." The crowd pressed closer. Kern's men shifted, hands moving toward their weapons. "You're accusing me of attempted murder?" Kern's voice was ice. "I'm presenting evidence," Doc replied. "The court can draw its own conclusions." Judge Harlow looked at the photographs, then at Kern, then at the crowd. Silas could see the calculation happening behind the man's eyes. Federal authority versus territorial law, political pressure versus evidence. "Your Honor," Esther Voss said, stepping forward with her leather case, "I have one more document." She unrolled the 1852 land grant, the brittle parchment crackling in the morning air. This deed predates United States jurisdiction by 24 years. It grants water rights to the Apache tribes in perpetuity. Signed by the Mexican territorial government, Mr. Kern's federal writ cannot supersede a legal claim that existed before the United States even controlled this territory. Kern's face went white. That document is irrelevant. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo preserved existing land grants, Esther finished. Article Weight, Section 2. My late husband was the surveyor who documented these water sources for the Mexican government. He worked directly with the Apache tribes to map the springs. She opened Samuel's journal and held up a sketch. This drawing shows an underground spring located directly beneath this courthouse, drawn in 1852. My husband wrote that only the Apache knew of its existence. Knowledge passed down through generations. Judge Harlow leaned forward. Are you saying there's a spring under this building? I'm saying, Esther replied, that if the Apache can prove they still possess that generational knowledge, then they never abandoned this land. They're the rightful stewards. All eyes turned to Nalin. She stood slowly, the willow divining rod in her hands. The crowd parted as she walked to the center of the courthouse steps, her sisters following behind her. She knelt and placed the forked branch on the stone, her hands resting lightly on each arm of the Y. Then she began to hum. The lullaby rose into the morning air, soft at first, then stronger. Her sisters joined in, their voices weaving together in harmony. The same song Silas had heard 12 years ago. The same song Nalin's grandmother had sung as she died. Nalin lifted the divining rod and walked slowly across the courthouse steps. 3 paces, 5, 7. The branch jerked downward so violently it nearly pulled from her hands. She stopped, marked the spot with her heel, and looked at Judge Harlow. Dig here. You find water. The judge hesitated, then nodded to 2 men in the crowd. Get shovels. It took 10 minutes. At 4 feet down, the earth turned damp. At 6 feet, water began to pool. At 8 feet, it gushed up fast enough that the men had to scramble out of the hole. The crowd erupted in shouts, some amazed, some angry, all stunned. Judge Harlow stared at the spring, then at Nalin, then at Esther's 1852 deed. How did you know? My grandmother taught me, Nalin said simply, and her grandmother taught her. 10 generations, we do not abandon, we remember. Before Kern could respond, a new voice cut through the noise. That's enough. Jacob Crow stepped forward, pulling off his hat. His face was streaked with tears. I tied those ropes. Kern paid me $50 to do it. He said it was just to scare them, make them run so he could claim abandonment. But I knew it was murder. Silas felt his heart stop. Jacob turned to face Kern, his voice breaking. You told me they'd survive. You said the ropes were loose enough. But I watched them hang, and I did nothing. He pulled his gun belt off and dropped it at the judge's feet. I'm guilty of attempted murder, of conspiracy, all of it. Kern's hand finally moved to his coat, but before he could draw, a new figure appeared on the steps, a man in a silver star, the territorial marshal. Thaddeus Kern, the marshal said, his voice carrying like a gunshot. You're under arrest for fraud, attempted murder, and conspiracy to commit federal crimes. Hand over that writ. Kern's face twisted. I'm a federal commissioner. You have no authority. Your commission just got revoked. The marshal held up a telegram. From the Department of the Interior? Seems they don't take kindly to officials who forge documents and hang children. Kern reached for his inside coat pocket, but the marshal was faster. He grabbed Kern's wrist and twisted, pulling out not a gun, but a small ink bottle, fresh, unopened, with a label that read, Santa Fe Trading Company, batch 1876-08. Brought your own ink to court, the marshal said dryly. That's bold. Doc Gale took the bottle, examined it, and held it up beside the writ. Same batch number as the ink on this document, which means... It means, Judge Harlow said heavily, that this writ was forged within the last month. The marshal snapped iron cuffs on Kern's wrist. Jacob Crow, you're under arrest too. Anyone else want to confess before I start asking questions? Kern's men scattered. Jacob stood still, head bowed, waiting for the cuffs. Silas walked to his brother and placed a hand on his shoulder. Why'd you tell the truth? Jacob looked up, his eyes red. Because I remembered something. When we were kids, I fell in a well. You climbed down and pulled me up. Even though you were scared of the dark, you didn't leave me. And his voice cracked. I left you, but I ain't leaving you again. The marshal led them both away, Kern cursing, Jacob silent. Judge Harlow stood and addressed the crowd. In light of the evidence presented, I hereby nullify the federal writ of abandonment. The 1852 land grant is recognized as valid. Water rights for the disputed territory are restored to the Apache claimants. He banged his gavel once. Final. The crowd erupted again, some cheering, some shouting in protest. But Silas only heard the sound of Nalin's lullaby, still echoing in his ears. The courthouse steps emptied slowly. People drifting away in clusters, some satisfied, some angry, most just confused about what they'd witnessed. Silas stood near the edge of the square, watching the marshal's wagon disappear toward the territorial prison, with Kern and Jacob both shackled in the back. Doc Gale appeared at his side, his medical bag slung over one shoulder. Your brother did the right thing in the end. Doesn't undo what he did. No, but it's a start. Doc pulled out the livestock deed and held it up. Judge ruled in your favor, means this goes back to you. 60 head, free and clear. Silas took the paper but didn't look at it. His eyes were on Nalin, who stood with her sisters near the spring they'd uncovered. The youngest was kneeling beside the water, filling a tin cup and passing it to the others. What happens now? Silas asked. Legally, the Apache have water rights to this territory in perpetuity. Can't be taken, can't be sold, can't be transferred. It's theirs. Doc smiled faintly. Of course, that's just 20 acres around the spring. Not exactly a kingdom. It's enough, Silas said. Esther Voss joined them, rolling up Samuel's journal with careful hands. Judge wants to meet with Nalin tomorrow. Talk about formalizing the claim, getting it registered with the territorial office. Make sure no one tries what Kern did again. She'll go, Silas said, but she'll want witnesses. I'll be there, Esther said, and I suspect you will too. Before Silas could answer, Nalin walked over. Her face was calm, but her eyes held something deeper. Relief, maybe, or exhaustion. Or the kind of peace that comes after a long fight ends. Judge says we can stay, she said. 20 acres. The spring. No one can take it. That's right. She looked at him for a long moment, then held out her hand. Not to shake, just open, palm up, an offering. Silas placed his hand in hers. Apache law says debt is paid with protection, Nalin said. You protected us. Now we protect you. You are not alone anymore, Silas Crow. You are family. He didn't know what to say to that. Didn't know if he deserved it. But when her sisters gathered around, 7 of them, bone-thin and rope-scarred but standing tall, he felt something shift in his chest. Something that had been broken for 12 years started to mend. There's one more thing, Nalin said. She turned to the judge, who was still packing up his papers. We want to share the land. Judge Harlow paused. Share it how? 20 acres is ours, but spring gives water to 40 more. We make agreement. Silas Crow has 20 acres beside us. Co-ownership, legal. The judge raised an eyebrow. That's highly unusual. So is everything else about today, Doc muttered. Nalin didn't waver. He cut our ropes, he gave his cows, he stood between us and guns. Apache law says he is family. White man's law should say same thing. Judge Harlow looked at Silas. You agreeable to this arrangement? Silas thought about the line camp, about 10 years of solitary work, checking water sources and counting cattle, about the sound of crows circling and the taste of dust and the hollow ache of living alone. Then he thought about last night, sitting by the fire, humming a lullaby with Nalin, feeling forgiveness settle over him like rain after drought. Yeah, he said, I'm agreeable. The judge drafted the deed right there on the courthouse steps, his pen scratching across parchment while the afternoon sun climbed higher. When it was done, he had Silas sign first, then each of the 7 sisters pressed their thumbprints beside his name. Dark ink on pale paper, permanent and binding. 20 acres to Silas Crow, the judge read aloud. 20 acres to the Apache claimants, represented by Nalin and her sisters. Joint stewardship of water rights in perpetuity. He stamped it with the territorial seal. Legal and binding. Nalin took the deed carefully, folded it, and tucked it inside her shirt next to her heart. What will you call him? Doc asked her. If he's family now, he needs an Apache name. Nalin considered this. Her head tilted. Her sisters spoke rapidly in their own language, debating. Finally, the youngest, the 9-year-old who'd pressed muddy handprints on Silas's palm days ago, stepped forward. Tse bika-i, she said shyly. Then in English, he who heard the song. Nalin smiled, the first real smile Silas had seen from her. Yes, not he who cuts the rope. That is what you did. But he who heard the song. That is who you are. You heard grandmother. You remembered. You came back. Silas felt his throat tighten. He crouched down to the youngest sister's level. What's your name? Kaya, she whispered. Well, Kaya, I'm honored. She threw her arms around his neck, sudden and fierce. One by one, the other sisters joined, 7 pairs of arms, 7 weights of trust and forgiveness and new beginnings. When they finally pulled back, Esther was wiping her eyes. Doc was studying his boots like they were the most interesting thing he'd ever seen. All right, Doc said gruffly. Enough sentiment. We got work to do. That spring needs a proper well built. Fencing for the property line, legal paperwork to file. And Silas, your cattle are still scattered across 40 miles. Somebody's got to round them up. I'll help, Nalin said. We all help, the other sisters echoed. Silas looked at them, these 7 warriors who'd survived hanging, who'd stood in court and proven their birthright, who'd chosen to call him family when they could have just as easily walked away. Then I reckon we better get started, he said. They walked back toward the line camp together as the sun began its descent. Behind them, the spring bubbled up through the courthouse steps, water that had been hidden for generations, now flowing free. Ahead, the desert stretched out vast and unforgiving, but somehow less lonely than it had been a week ago. Nellen began to hum as they walked. Her sisters joined in, and after a moment, so did Silas. The lullaby carried on the evening wind, a song of survival and memory, and morning that always comes, even after the darkest night.